John Donne is one of the greatest non-dramatic poets of English literature. His extraordinary style was such a success that it was imitated by a number of poets of his time. Poets who were later known as metaphysical poets. But let me tell you something. This is not a fair comparison because, with the exception of George Herbert, they are almost minor poets when compared with a towering figure such as Donne. But fair or unfair, Donne's popularity did not continue for long, because certain political and social changes took place in England in the second part of the 17th century, which finally decreased general interest in him. However, some 300 years later, at the beginning of the 20th century, Donne was rediscovered and acknowledged as the greatest writer of love poetry in English literature. He also had a significant impact on modern poetry. But what sort of a man was he, and what sort of a life did he have? Donne's life is believed to fall into three distinct periods. In the first part of his life, up to 1601, he's an up-and-coming young man in his 20s, well-read, very knowledgeable, well-educated, though with no university degree, despite the fact that he attended both Oxford and Cambridge. This is because he was born into a Catholic family at a time when being a Catholic could put your life in serious danger, let alone being trusted with a high-profile job. However, sometime in the 1590s, he converts to the Protestant faith, or to be on the safe side, he just stops being a Catholic. And this suddenly paves the way for him, and he starts climbing the social ladder. Soon he's appointed as General Secretary to a high-ranking nobleman by the name of Sir Thomas Egerton. And a little later, he becomes a Member of Parliament, though for a short period of time. Now, all of this shows that Donne here, at this point, is on the verge of becoming a diplomat or a lawyer, and is expected to end up finally in the Queen's court as a magnificent courtier. As for his private life, we know that he was particularly interested in women, or as a contemporary puts it, he's a great visitor of ladies, ladies in the sense of ladies of the English aristocracy. He was also very much fond of plays and traveling, and so we have here the portrait of a young man who is certainly enjoying life. Now, the poetry of this period reflects the same. They're mostly about women, especially their infidelity, and sort of encourage the reader to try mistresses of different types, or present clever ways of seducing women, and other themes along those lines. Good examples are Go and Catch a Falling Star, or The Indifferent, or The Flea. At the beginning of the second period, Donne is nearly 30. He has fallen in love with a nobleman's daughter by the name of Anne More, a minor, about 17 years old. Knowing that her father would never approve of the union, he decides to secretly marry her, which proves to be a turning point in his life, an unfortunate turning point. All of a sudden, all his hopes of worldly progress are dashed. He is briefly put to prison, dismissed from his job as a secretary, and worst of all, is denied any regular important job for over a decade. So we find him poor, penniless, with a large family to support. A family of 12 children, 5 of them die before reaching maturity. But even at such hard times, he still has influential friends among courtiers to help him. Even these patrons can't rescue him from his misery. The poems of these years tell us about his deep love for his wife, as well as his ever-growing religious emotions and meditations. In the third and final part of his life, we see that Donne, who is in his mid-40s now, has recently lost his wife. He has also become an Anglican priest and is awarded an honorary doctorate in divinity by Cambridge University. Within just a few years, he will be appointed as Dean of St. Paul's Cathedral, the second highest clerical position in England. He'll preach to great congregations of courtiers, merchants, tradespeople, lawyers, and even the king himself. As a matter of fact, it was King James I who insisted that Donne should take holy orders, because he knew what he was capable of doing with words. In fact, Donne was the favourite preacher of both James and Charles I. There's no doubt that he's one of the best preachers of the 17th century. Parts of his sermons and religious writings are still strikingly beautiful and novel. His poems of this period mostly deal with the theme of divine love. Now, is there any question up to here? Of course, I don't know about the intentions of Donne and his younger brother Henry. Henry also went to Oxford and Cambridge with him. But perhaps like other Catholics, he was optimistic for some change to take place. The 16th century was not quite a stable era. Henry VIII, the King of England, had turned into Protestantism some 30 or 40 years before Donne was born, and with him the whole country had converted. He made it necessary for everyone who wanted to have a job either in the state or the church, to take the oath of supremacy. The oath of supremacy said something like this: I acknowledge that the King of England is also the head of the church, and all that sort of thing. 6 years after him, Mary was the queen, Mary, Henry VIII's daughter. And she was a devout Catholic, so she repealed such laws and oaths. But in the reign of Elizabeth, Mary's half-sister, things turned against Catholics once again. And even students at graduation had to take the oath of supremacy. So perhaps Donne and his family thought one day these restrictions would be lifted. And it almost happened when the Catholic King of Spain, Philip II, attacked England in the reign of Elizabeth. Of course, the Spanish Armada was defeated at sea, but the shadow of Catholicism was always hovering over England. You might have wondered, like me, what on earth this metaphysical poetry is. Is it writing about spirits and angels that make it metaphysical? What does metaphysical mean in the first place? By the way, it's not only metaphysical poetry that we also use the phrase metaphysical conceit, which is a specific kind of comparison within this school. It is true that some people use the word metaphysical in the sense of supernatural, but let me tell you that this is not the correct use of the word. This mistake goes back to the 1st century BC, when a man called Andronicus of Rhodes decided to arrange Aristotle's works into separate proper books. But one day he came across a treatise that couldn't come under any existing title. So he decided to put it after the book of physics, and because of that he named it After Physics, or in Greek, Metaphysics. only because meta was later interpreted as beyond, so metaphysical gained the distorted meaning of beyond the physical or supernatural. Metaphysics is a branch of philosophy which deals with both physical and non-physical subjects. In other words, it studies anything that exists or could exist, but important for our discussion is the fact that it requires more than any other branch of philosophy extremely abstract reasoning. And this sense is what should be meant by metaphysical when we say metaphysical poetry. A style which is based on very complicated reasoning woven into the fabric or structure of a poem. I said it should be this way because the two men who gave this title to Donne's school of poetry did not explain why they found it metaphysical. One of them, John Donne, gives us the impression that he uses the term because he finds in this poetry both inappropriate and confusing reasoning, as well as an element of the supernatural. The second man, Dr. Samuel Johnson, keeps quiet about this and only goes on to describe the school, disapprovingly of course. But ironically, it is Johnson who's taken the credit for the metaphysical, because he gave currency to the expression, and Dryden, who seems to have used the term for the first time and at least partially justify it, is often ignored in discussions of literature by writers or teachers. Now, to put it in a nutshell, metaphysical poetry is called so because somehow, like metaphysics, it is based on abstract, difficult to understand reasoning. In this sense, and only in this sense, metaphysical poetry can be used of the school Donne had. Well, you're quite right. Metaphysical is definitely not a very good term. But the point is that, words such as metaphysical, these are the product of a long historical process. There are lots of words that are not correctly used in English, especially in English literature. We are now talking about the 17th century, okay? The word 17th century means from 1600 to 1700 almost. But this is not what we mean by the 17th century in English literature. We mean something between 1603, when Queen Elizabeth died and James I came to power, to 1660, when Charles II came to power. So we have here a period of, say, 57 years. And we call this 57 years the 17th century. And the rest of that, from 1660 to the end of the century, is called Restoration, which is often considered as part of the 18th century. So once you start changing these terms, you've got to change lots of them, and that's not definitely possible.